All right, here we are again. So let's see. Where did we leave off? I think we are supposed to do the chapter 4 problem set today. Yes, let's do that first. First, let's go back to Moodle and we'll take a look at it. Oops, that's not it. Okay. All right, here we go. So the chapter 4 problem set is right here. So we'll get that going. Now, of course, this is based on supply and demand. So from not the last time we met, from the previous week. All right, so let's get this going. Let me just save it. All right, so first things first, starting from a position of equilibrium, what is the impact on equilibrium price and quantity of the following? Now, in these cases, you're not absolutely required to draw a diagram, but I think it's a pretty good idea. So let's try this one. So remember, the price is on the vertical axis. The quantity is on the horizontal axis. We have our upward sloping supply curve, or downward sloping demand curve. Where they cross is the point of equilibrium. And we're going to change the demand curve. So let's call this point 1. We could call this P1 and Q1. Hold on a second. All right, so those are the initial equilibrium values. This is, we'll call this D1 because we're going to switch it over to D2. Now remember, an increase always means shift something to the right. Whether it's supply or demand, an increase means we're shifting this curve to the right. And of course, the supply curve hasn't changed. So at this new equilibrium point, between the new demand curve and the original supply curve, we have a new price and a new quantity. And so you can see by the direction these have moved, the price went up. I'll just write that as P up to indicate that it increased, and the quantity also went up. So as a result of the increase in demand, people are buying more of the product, but they're also paying a higher price for it. That's what you would expect, because of course, you know, the supply itself is based on the cost of production, and normally the cost of production increases more output is produced. So in other words, people can have more of the product if they want it, but they just have to expect to pay a higher price for it. Very good. Now, decrease in demand is just, of course, just the opposite. So let's draw that picture. We don't really have to. It should be pretty clear that the price and the quantity will both go down. But why don't we prove it with a diagram? Okay, it's good practice. And sometimes, you know, you might think, well, I get what's happening. But, you know, it's always good to check. All right, here's S. Here's D. We'll call it D1 again. Call that point 1. P1 and Q1. Oh, hold on. And then the demand curve will shift to the left. And so we'll move down to here. Oh, one more thing I should have added to this graph. just to make absolutely clear that we're shifting to the right. Here we're shifting to the left. And so we have a new equilibrium point, price and quantity. And so just as we expected, both the price and the quantity went down. So here's an interesting point that we want to pay attention to. When the demand changes, either the price and quantity both increase or they both decrease. They never move in opposite directions. I just want to point that out because when we look at the supply curve, we'll see that that is not the case. With the supply curve, it turns out the price and quantity actually do move in different directions. So let's see how that works. Okay, so first the increase in supply. In this case, it's the supply curve that's shifting, and it's shifting to the right because it is an increase. Oh, okay, Elizabeth. All right, I see. Thanks. All right, so the price is here. The quantity is here. Here's the supply. Here's the demand. Here's the initial equilibrium. And now this time the supply curve is shifting. I'll call this S1 and I'll call this one S2. Shifting to the right because there's an increase. And we can find the new equilibrium quantity. Oops. That would be 2, of course. And the price. Now, this is a great outcome for consumers because we can have more of the product and the price goes down. So this often happens when the costs of production fall, which is often brought about by improvement in technology. So a lot of high-tech products that we know and take for granted, the price keeps dropping and they keep getting better, and we keep buying more of them because it's cheaper to produce them than it was in the past. So here, if you notice, the price and quantity do move in opposite directions. Okay. Now, the decrease in supply, this is the case that we do not want to see at all. Okay, let's see why. All right, this is the initial supply curve. And a decrease this time means we shift to the left. And now you see, oh, this is bad news because we have a higher price for the good and less of it. So we're paying a higher price for a smaller quantity of this good. This is bad news, and this often comes about when the costs of producing this good go up for some reason. So let's say oil prices suddenly start going up. This might be the response in the gasoline market. Less gas is made available to the gas stations, and you're paying a higher price for it. So just to summarize this one, when supply changes, the equilibrium price and quantity move in opposite directions. Okay, unlike demand, where they both go in the same direction, in this case, they're going in opposite directions because the price went up and the quantity went down. All right, whereas up here, it was the other way around. So those are our 4 basic cases. If you understand these, you're in pretty good shape. And if you're not sure, you can always just draw the pictures. After a while, you'll start to understand this intuitively, and you may not need the pictures, but it never hurts to draw the graphs. I mean, really, it's very helpful. It provides you a lot of useful information. So anyway, now let's look at these. What is the relationship between quantity supplied and quantity demanded when there's a shortage of a good? All right, so again, it doesn't actually ask you to draw a diagram, but why don't we do that? Because we want to remind ourselves what a shortage looks like. So basically what's happening here is that we're not in equilibrium. We have equilibrium up here, but unfortunately, for some reason, the price in the market is too low to be in equilibrium. And what happens is that at P2, you've got, here's your quantity demanded and here's your quantity supplied. And the most important detail here is that the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied at such a low price. And so, tell you what, let's call this Q1 and Q3. So the problem here is that Q3 is what we want to buy. Q1 is what we're able to buy. And so there's a shortage equal to this amount. Not enough is being produced at such a low price to satisfy the demand for this product. So this is what we mean by a shortage. And so the natural reaction to this by the producers is to raise the price. But here they just want to know what is the relationship between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. So ultimately, this is what you want right here. And it doesn't matter if you write the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. Of course, it means the same thing. The most important detail is that people want to buy more of the product than is available to them. Now, oh, here it is in part B. Now they want to know what happens to the price. All right, so the producer sees this happening. They know that there's a shortage of this product. They can't keep up with the demand. So when there's a shortage, the price rises. Okay. Now, it should eventually rise all the way up to the equilibrium price, because then at that point, the shortage has been eliminated. So in other words, we would expect to see P2 start to go up. And as we do, the quantity supplied and demand will fall into balance, and then no more adjustments will need to take place. Okay, so when the producer sees that there's a shortage, they'll raise the price. And so more will be available, but people will buy less. And finally, we'll find ourselves back here at equilibrium. Let's call that 0.1. So in other words, the shortage won't persist for very long. The producers have a very powerful incentive to change the price because this is not maximizing their profits. Okay. In fact, the whole purpose of being in business is to maximize your profits. Anything else is not acceptable. All right. Now, how about the case of the surplus? All right. So this is the case where the price is just too high. People aren't buying this product because it's too expensive. So here's our equilibrium. But the price is up here somewhere. Let's call that P2, and I guess we could call this Q1 and Q3. Wait a minute, what did I do up here? Oh, wait a minute. Oh. All right, I guess I was being a little inconsistent here with these Qs. Yeah, let me change this. This really should have been, not that it really matters that much, but this should have been Q1 because this is the equilibrium. This could have been 2 and 3, let's say. So the difference between these two is the actual shortage. All right, I think that's better. That's more consistent. All right, so we'll do the same thing down here. And so this will be Q2 and Q3. But keep in mind, this time Q3 is the quantity supplied, and this time Q2 is the quantity demanded. So because the supply curve is further to the right of the demand curve at this point, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded because people aren't willing to pay such a high price for this product. It would be like, imagine Starbucks suddenly decided to charge $5 for a cup of coffee. Well, some people would still buy it, but a lot of people would not. And they would find themselves with way too much coffee without people buying all of it. And they would realize that there's a problem. So the problem here is that the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And this is what we mean by a surplus. This distance here is a surplus. Or we could write Q3 minus Q2 is the size of the surplus. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm telling you, this happens every time. The net is just not as reliable as people think it is. Almost every class, somebody gets kicked out. Yeah, just get back in as fast as you can. Okay. So, and then of course, in response to this, you would expect the price to drop because the producer again recognizes that they're overcharging for this product. So they will lower the price. And as you can see, the price will fall at least until equilibrium is reestablished. Okay, so in other words, it won't go any further than that. Once we hit P1 in this example, there's no reason to keep lowering the price. So gradually, the price will drop from P2 to P1. And then once we hit that point, the producer will recognize that we've established equilibrium, and therefore we can stop lowering the price. Okay, now, how about 3 factors that can increase the demand for a normal good? The magic word there is normal, by the way. Keep an eye on that because that affects the way we react to it when our incomes change. Now, we know more than 3, but you know what? What I'm going to do here is I'm basically going to put in all of them, and you can basically decide which ones you want to write. Any 3 will do. Now, keep in mind, this is a normal good, so we'll start with an increase in the taste for a good, an increase in consumer income. Remember, this only applies to normal goods. And now here, I've got 2 things going on here at once. This is the idea that the price of related goods affect the demand for a normal good. An increase in the price of a substitute or a decrease in the price of a complement. These would both increase the demand for any good. It doesn't have to be normal. In other words, imagine if you're not sure, think of examples, Coke and Pepsi. If Pepsi becomes more expensive, we buy more Coke. Complements are things that go together. If the price of French fries goes up, we might buy less ketchup. Okay, so that's what that's all about. These are the so-called related goods. And then, let's see, what else? Oh, the expected future price of the good rises. In other words, we expect it to become more expensive in the future. Therefore, we might stock up on it today. All right, before the price goes up. Like if you're worried about orange juice becoming in short supply or the price going up because they've been having trouble with the crops in Florida, then you might be tempted to go out and stock up an orange juice. Now, as far as the market goes, the number of consumers in the market increases. That refers to the market demand as opposed to the individual demand, but still, that is a definite factor that can increase the demand for normal good. And then finally, expected incomes and or credit increase. So in other words, if you expect to have more, if you expect your income to rise in the future or to have access to more credit, you might buy more of a product today because let's face it, we're all very impatient when it comes to buying things. So, you know what I mean? Like if you are pretty sure that you're going to get a raise at work, you might not wait until you actually see the raise to buy that new car you've always wanted. Okay, so those are the 6. Now, if it asks for 3, you only have to give 3, but I just want to mention them. And then B, what about the supply? Well, again, it's the same thing. We definitely have more than 3 factors, but let's go through some of these. For example, productivity improves, which means that the reason why this is helping is because the cost of producing goods decreases when productivity goes up. Okay. Input prices decrease. Okay, so in other words, if we are producing gasoline, and crude oil prices drop, then the cost of producing gasoline drops, and we will most likely see an increase in the supply of gas. Okay. How about this one? Now, this is the related goods. A decrease in the price of substitutes in production, that is, or an increase in the price of complements in production. Okay, now I just want to point out, hold on one second. I want you to be able to see them side by side. When we're talking about demand, the demand for a good will go up if the price of a substitute goes up or the price of a complement goes down. When it comes to supply, let's see, where are we? Here we go. It's just the opposite. Okay, so now up here, there was an increase in the price of a substitute. Here, it's a decrease in the price of substitutes that can increase the supply. And same thing with complements. Up here, we had a decrease. Down here, we have an increase. So it works in the opposite direction because remember, the supplier is trying to make a profit. The consumer is trying to minimize the expense of buying goods and services. So if we forget, that's one way to remember. They're opposites. All right. So what else do we have on our list? How about this one? The price of a good is expected to decrease in the future. In other words, if we're selling a product where we expect the market price to drop in the future, we may want to sell more of that today while the price is still relatively high. Okay, so, or like, for example, goods that we're selling that are becoming obsolete, we may want to sell them as fast as possible before the price starts falling off. And then finally, this is for the market as a whole, the number of producers of the good increases. Of course, if there's more companies making, let's say, bagels, it could be anything, then there'll be more bagels in the marketplace. All right. So, boy, that reminds me, did that Einstein Brothers place ever open up again? Has anyone actually been in there? No? Okay. Yes. Oh, so it is open. They just opened just before the COVID. No, they just opened that place. They'd been building it for a while. It was always behind schedule. They kept delaying it. Then finally, it was open for like what, a few weeks before the COVID hit. And so now, I haven't been on the campus in almost 2 years now. So I was wondering what happened to that place. I mean, it was a good idea, but the timing wasn't good. So, I guess they're still struggling to figure out what to do about food there. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, if you're in Manhattan, of course, there's bagel places all over the place. So the more bagel stores there are, of course, the more it will be produced. Or it's like bakeries. I mean, the more bakeries there are, the more cakes are available. All right, now this last one specifically asks for a graph. Okay, so what you're being asked to do is show what happens because as a result of an increase in consumer incomes to a normal good. All right, so basically what it wants you to do is show that the demand for the product increases because it's a normal good. And so you can show, once again, when the demand goes up, as we saw earlier, then the price goes up, but so does the quantity. But this time, what they're really interested in is the graph. I mean, you can explain it, and you should, but it's the graph the question was really about showing the graph. Now, how would you know that the demand increases? Because it says that this is a normal good and consumer incomes have gone up, which means we'll buy more of this product. All right, what else? Oh, that was it. Okay, so there was just one time you actually were required to draw a graph, but I think it's a good idea in all these cases, just so you can visualize exactly what's going on. Oh, I just realized this is not right. Q3 minus Q2 is the shorted, sorry. Okay, let me just make sure I didn't do that wrong, the other one. Yeah, this one is fine. Beautiful. All right. So now we're in pretty good shape for chapter 4. Let me save this. Of course, as usual, I will post this on Moodle as soon as we're done. And so you can study off of it. Very good. All right. Now, we're not completely done with chapter 5. We have a ways to go with chapter 5, where we're talking about GDP. I just want to also remind you that we do have some fun videos to look at. Some more good fun videos. We looked at these first two, and then we've got some more that we'd like to look at. We want to understand a few new concepts. We kind of understand already what GDP is and how it's calculated. We also understand how it's different than GNP. In fact, let me download 5. Okay, just a quick review of what we've been doing. Okay. Okay, today is the 24th. All right, so GDP, as we've seen, is a measure of national income or national production. It represents both sides of that same coin. And we start out by noting that business cycles consist of changes in GDP. We go through 4 phases: expansion, where the economy is growing very quickly; the peak, where we hit the limit of how much we can produce; then we start to slow down in a contraction; and then we hit the bottom in a trough. And so over time, the economy tends to look like a big cycle or a series of cycles. And so we go through this up and down and up and down. Now, of course, the ups and downs aren't always the same. Sometimes they're very quick. Sometimes they take a long time to develop. But this line here represents what we call a trend line, which represents the average growth during that period. So if the economy followed this line, it'd be perfect, because you wouldn't have these extreme upturns and downturns. But that's not really practical. Instead, policymakers try to keep the business cycle as smooth as possible. We try to avoid extreme peaks and extreme troughs, because peaks, as great as they sound, can trigger inflation, and troughs, of course, can trigger unemployment. We don't want either one of those things. So we want the economy to grow steadily. And in practice, well, we'll discuss this later in the chapter, but there are numbers that the government has in mind when they try to keep the economy growing at a certain rate that, from experience, they know will not increase inflation or unemployment. So that's our business cycle. Now, how did we measure GDP? Well, first, remember, we only include final goods. We don't want to count intermediate goods, because then we're actually including them twice in the calculations of GDP. For example, wheat, you don't normally go to the store and buy wheat and then chew on it. No, the wheat that you eat is part of the bread that you buy. So when wheat is produced by farmers, we will not count it separately from the value of the bread that is being produced by the bakers. So we have to avoid counting intermediate goods and only focus on final goods. Remember, the whole point of this is to capture the value of what's being produced during the year. All right, Fernando.
So what you're saying is that for this example, the wheat is the intermediate good,
Yes.
and bread is the final good that will be, sold for like
That's right.
profit.
Exactly. Yes. So the farmer sells the wheat to the baker, but the baker is not buying it to sell it directly to you. He's buying it to turn it into bread. So the GDP accounts would only measure the bread, not the wheat. The logic being that the bread contains the wheat, and so the value of the bread includes the value of the wheat. That's why we have to do it this way. Okay. Now, sometimes it's easy to do this, sometimes it's not. I mean, it's not always. I mean, a lot of these calculations can run into gray areas, but I think this is a pretty simple one because obviously you don't directly consume wheat. It has to be converted into something that's edible. So you will not see in the GDP accounts the value of the wheat and the value of the bread both listed. It's always going to be the final good. The same thing happens with cars. I mean, cars have a lot of materials built into them. They use steel and they use glass and they use rubber and they use plastics and they use electronics and all this and that. So those products are not being counted separately from the value of the car. What you're doing is you're trying to capture the final product, which is the car, not the steel, for example. Okay. Also, we try to only focus on currently produced products, things that were produced during that calendar year. So goods that were previously produced would not be counted. If somebody buys a house that was built 10 years ago, for example, that doesn't count. Only houses that were built this year. Or if you buy a used car, it does not count. But if you buy a brand new car, then that gets counted in the current year's GDP. And also, I think we mentioned somewhere along the way that ultimately what we're trying to do here is capture how much people are spending on these new final products. Technically, you could count the incomes that are being generated by these products, but it's a very messy process. So we typically will focus our attention on the expenditures side. In other words, how much are we actually spending on these products? Yeah, so a house, in order to count a new house, it has to have been built during that year. Otherwise, you're counting something that didn't happen that year. Now, the borders part, GDP is focused only on what's going on within the borders of a country. It's not concerned with citizenship. So in other words, any product that's built within the borders of the United States, even by foreign countries, is being counted, foreign companies, is being counted in US GDP. Now, of course, that means we're including foreign products within our GDP, but we're also leaving out American products that are being built overseas. So, you're gaining and you're losing. There's no measure that's ever going to be perfect, but the hope is that they can capture what kind of economic activity is happening within the border of the United States. That most economists would agree that is the most relevant measure of how well the economy is doing. But on the other hand, we have this other alternative measure called GNP, which does in fact focus on the citizens and not the locations. So let's say, for example, if Ford produces cars in its UK factories, that will get counted in US GNP because it's an American company, but not US GDP because it's not being built in the United States. On the other hand, if Nissan, which it does, produce cars in the United States, those would get counted in US GDP because they're being built in the US, but they're leaving it out from US GNP because it's not an American company. So, both measures, GDP and GNP, have their advantages and disadvantages. But, until maybe 30 years ago, most economists thought that GNP was the better measure. But somewhere along the way, there was a change in the economics profession, and it suddenly became, I guess, everyone decided that, after all, GDP is probably the better measure. So that's normally what you see. Like if you were to look in, let's say, an article on the internet about the economy, let's see what we can come up with here. Hold on. Okay, so here's an article in Bloomberg. This is from the summer. US GDP trails forecast even as consumer spending surges. So what they're saying is that the economy Now, this is during the summer when the economy was still struggling because of COVID. But so what they're basically telling us is that GDP grew at around 6.5% on an annual basis, whereas economists thought it might go up by 8.4%. But housing spending remained strong. It went up by about 11.8%, which, because you can imagine that during the worst of the COVID, people were not buying new houses. And so there's a lot of pent up demand. And so once it became possible to buy houses again, people were actually going ahead and buying houses, which is a good sign. But the overall economy didn't grow as fast as economists had hoped. But the thing is, if you notice, the entire article is about GDP. There's no mention in here of GNP, because that's the number that economists are currently really focused on. So you see these articles quite a bit. There's always discussions about what's going on with GDP. How fast is it growing? Is it going faster than economists hoped? Is it growing slower? What are the reasons for this? What components of it are growing very quickly? What components are growing very slowly? But you'll see the vast majority of them will be talking about GDP, not so much GNP. Anyway, but yeah, you might want to check these out once in a while, because you can see that there's a lot of discussion here about what contributes to GDP and what can cause it to slow down. And so, like here, for example, they're saying that firms' inability to keep merchandise stocked and bottlenecks in production are capping the speed at which the economy can grow. And it's not surprising, since a lot of firms were completely shut down during the COVID. And so it will take time for production to reach more normal levels. Okay, in fact, this economist is saying the downside surprise is the inventory component, meaning that inventories are not growing as fast as we'd hoped. Okay, now inventories are part of GDP. I think we mentioned this when we looked at the different components. Oh, by the way, algebraically, this is how the two are related to each other. And we did introduce net factor income receipts last time. This involves returns to land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that are coming from foreign countries. Okay, so in other words, Americans do work overseas, some of them do. They may earn interest from investments in foreign countries. They may own land in foreign countries or other types of natural resources, or they may run businesses in foreign countries. The same thing is true of foreigners. A lot of foreigners work in the United States and earn wages in the US. They may own property for which they're earning interest or rent. And they also may own businesses in the United States from which they earn profits. So what this is meant to capture is what is flowing into the US from these resources and what is flowing out of the US from these resources to foreigners. The difference between the two is called net factor income receipts. And so let's just say if Bill Gates opens up a Microsoft, well, he's not in Microsoft anymore, but let's say Microsoft opens up a store in France, their profits are being earned in France, but they're American profits. So they would move into this category, net factor income receipts, but they'd be excluded from GDP because those are profits earned in France. So that's what we mean by saying that GNP is really focused on citizenship. We're trying to capture what's going on with Americans throughout the world. Okay, but then for GNP, if let's say a French company is doing business in the US, their profits would be considered net factor income receipts, but they would be excluded from GDP. Okay. Actually, no, sorry, they'd be in GDP, but not in GNP because they're flowing out of the country. So anyway, but let's just remember that this is the one that's really the most important, GDP. Now, also, if you're wondering, the actual value of these two numbers is pretty similar for the United States. In fact, maybe we can find out what the difference is right now. Now, it's still 2021, so we won't have that information just yet for 2021, but we can still look up the two numbers for last year. So here's GNP. about 22 point, just under 23 trillion. And now let's go and get GDP. It's almost exactly the same. I think the GNP was at 200 billion higher, but you can see they're almost the same. They're very, very close. Now, for some countries, that's not true, though. But for the United States and most of the major Western European countries, the two measures are very similar, but still economists find it easier to use GDP because I guess they think it does a better job of explaining standards of living in a country, because that's really what this is an attempt to capture, standards of living. So anyway, the components of GDP, now this is based on the expenditures approach. We assume that all spending in the US falls into one of four categories: consumption expenditure on consumer goods, investment spending, which is mainly coming from businesses, government expenditures, which only count actual purchases of goods and services, and net exports, which is the difference between imports and exports. Now, we'll analyze net exports in more detail later on, but right now, we just want to remind ourselves that with consumption expenditure, for all practical purposes, we can call anything that we might buy either a good or a service. And if it's a good, we can think of it as durable or non-durable. Durable meaning that it's supposed to last at least 3 years. Non-durable means it's meant to be consumed immediately. Okay, and then of course we know what services are. Like if you pay somebody to do your taxes, or just pay somebody to write up a will, or if you go to the doctor or the dentist, these are all services. You're not getting a physical product, you're getting something useful done. So anyway, then with investment spending, we have residential, that would be housing. When you buy a new house, it goes into this category, residential investment. Then non-residential or business investment is when businesses buy products whose only purpose is to help them run their businesses. Like, I think we use the example of Starbucks buying new blenders. If Starbucks buys blenders for their stores, that's business investment because they're using it to sell products to the customers. If you and I buy a blender, that becomes consumer spending because we're taking it home and using it to make smoothies for ourselves. We're not running a business. And then here's the inventories. Now, sometimes businesses build products and it takes a while to sell them, especially something like cars. Okay. If a car is built, let's say December 2020, but is not sold until January 2021, it goes into the 2020 GDP accounts as an increase in inventories. All right. In other words, it is thought of as a type of investment. But if the car had been sold to a customer, it would have been counted as consumer spending. All right. So the distinction is that it's consumer spending if somebody actually buys the car. It's an increase in inventories if the car is built but not yet sold. Okay, so again, residential investment primarily is new households or new housing. Non-residential investment is business spending on anything they need to run their business, like equipment or software or buildings or factories. Inventories mean the production of new goods that haven't been sold yet. And we also discussed the idea that this category is very sensitive to interest rates. When interest rates go up, that tends to cut into spending on these categories because these three categories tend to be financed with borrowing. Like with a new house, you get a mortgage from the bank. Business investment tends to be financed by either bank loans or by issuing bonds, which are essentially loans from customers or investors. Same thing with inventory. So if interest rates go up, this category is usually going to be impacted very quickly and not in a good way. So when the Fed raises rates, as we'll discuss in great detail later on, it's because they want to trim back some of this investment spending and help keep inflation from getting out of hand. It also will have an impact on the durable goods in this category. Durable goods are the ones that are typically financed with credit. And so therefore, interest rates going up will tend to reduce our spending on durable goods. Now, of course, if interest rates go down, the opposite happens. So we'll have this discussion again in a later chapter. But for now, it's enough to note what are the components of GDP and what are some of the factors that affect those components. And then finally, well, yes, government spending is straightforward, but remember, we don't count transfer payments, like, for example, a tax refund or a Social Security payment, because the government isn't actually buying anything in those cases. They're simply transferring money into somebody else's pocket. This only includes actual purchases of goods and services, like if the government decides to buy new computers for the Pentagon or something, that would be considered defense spending. Or if they decide to buy new carpets for the, I don't know, Department of Homeland Security, that probably would be counted non-defense. But then also states and local governments also have their own expenditures. This all gets counted in GDP. So like if a state builds a new bridge, that gets counted as GDP. If a local government builds a new parking garage, I guess, that would get counted as GDP. All right, now, net exports. We looked at this briefly last time, and we saw that the US tends to have a very large deficit in this category because while we export a large quantity of goods and services overseas, we tend to buy even more products from foreigners. So exports are sales to foreign countries. Imports are purchases from foreign countries. And so the relationship between the two of these gives us our net exports. And it's very simple, exports minus imports. And if our imports exceed our exports, we can actually have a negative category here, which reduces the size of GDP. Okay. Now, they did mention this in one of the videos. They mentioned that, I think it was a story, the example had something to do with France. Selling farm equipment to the French means that we produced more, even though we sold it to foreigners. But if we buy French wines, that means we spent money on something that was actually produced outside the US. So that reduces our GDP. All right. If you want to look at this data, any data really for that matter, comes from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. And it comes from the St. Louis Fed. And you can get almost anything you want there for free. They have nice charts. They have they have data that can be downloaded into Excel. And so this is a picture of the US trade balance going back to the 60s. And you can see this black line represents a balance. If you were right here, that means your imports and exports would be the same. So under the line means it's a deficit. Above the line means it's a surplus. So you don't see a lot of above the line, do you? No. But now, and look at this, way down here in the early 2000s, the deficit in a single year got, what is it? It was over $800 billion. Then there was a nasty recession here. This gray line, these gray bars are recessions typically. And that will tend to improve our trade balance just because Americans will buy less foreign products because they're worried about the state of the economy. So when you look at it like that, you might think, the deficits look scary, but would we rather have a recession and a lower trade deficit, or would we rather have a booming economy and a large trade deficit? Well, I would say that we'd probably rather have a booming economy and a large trade deficit. It's kind of like an individual who increases their debt 20%, but they increase their income 30%. It's true that their debt is growing, but it's also true that their income is growing even faster. So that doesn't necessarily represent a problem. So anyway, now let's see, what else do we go over? So anyway, the strength of the dollar is a very major component of this trade balance. And I think we had this discussion last time. The stronger dollar paradoxically makes our trade deficit get worse because it makes it cheaper for us to buy foreign products and more expensive for foreigners to afford our products. and vice versa. So a strong dollar is often accompanied by a very large trade deficit. So again, when the economy is booming, the dollar tends to get stronger. So those factors tend to lead to a higher deficit. But like I said, if the reason for this deficit is because our economy is so strong, it isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. All right, it's just a sign that the U.S. economy is very strong, possibly compared to our trade partners. All right, what else? Now, we tied all this together at the end with the GDP identity. So this is just an algebraic identity, which just says Y, which is GDP, comes from C, consumer spending, I, investment spending, G, government spending, and NX, net exports. And so everything in the economy that we produce falls into one of these four categories. Okay, so now, having said that, by the way, I just want to mention, we'll see this later on, these numbers aren't perfect. There are inconsistencies, there are gaps in here, there are problems. So the numbers are good, but they're not perfectly accurate. There's information missing from here. In particular, information that people don't want the government to know about. For example, what if you are working at a job where it's completely off the books? Nobody knows about it. That will not find its way into this GDP identity. What if you are engaged in crime? Okay, obviously that information doesn't find its way back to the government. It doesn't get counted. Or, there's other categories too that don't find their way in here, like services that you perform without being paid. Like if you volunteer to work on somebody's car, or what if you fix your own car? So there's a lot of information that doesn't end up getting measured in these accounts. But the government does the best it can. And, when we look at these numbers, it's understood that they're not perfect, but this is the best that we have. And, of course, the same thing is true for all countries. So later on, we're going to see that one of the drawbacks to this GDP measure is the accuracy is not it's not perfect. Important information is definitely missing from here. And most likely that information causes the GDP identity to understate the true value of American economic activity. So in other words, if anything, this is a bit of a pessimistic look at the state of our economy. All right, well, anyway, now I did mention the incomes approach. All of this was based on the expenditures approach. Incomes come from the four factors of production: wages to labor, interest to capital, rent to landowners, and profits for entrepreneurs. Now, next here, you'll see a discussion about how this is done. I think we can kind of gloss over this a little. I really want to strongly de-emphasize this because it's really, to me, not as important. How exactly do you do this? So, no, we'll take a quick peek at it, but I don't want to overly emphasize this because look at this. If you're using the incomes approach, look how much more complex this becomes. And to make things even worse, you would think that the two approaches would give us the exact same number, but they don't. There's always inconsistencies there. And so we have to include this little item here called statistical discrepancy, which basically means it's a fudge factor. It recognizes that the two approaches are not giving us the exact same numbers. And so this is how we make them equal to each other. So, and this one involves taxes and it involves depreciation. Depreciation, I just want to briefly mention what that is. If you own a car, you know what depreciation is. What happens when you buy a brand new car? At the end of the year, what's happened to the value of that car? Yes.
Doesn't it like depreciate?
Yes, the value goes down because it's, the more you drive it, the less value it has. So depreciation refers to the loss of value of typically capital equipment that is used by businesses to run their businesses, like the blenders in Starbucks. They don't last forever. They wear down. You can only get so many drinks out of a blender. So depreciation refers to the loss of value of equipment that is being used to run a business. Okay. Your car also has depreciation. It's the same thing, but it isn't. The difference between the depreciation experienced by a business and a person is that the depreciation experienced by a business is tax deductible. Not so for individuals, but it's the same concept, the loss of value that occurs when you use a product like a car or equipment in a business. And so it's not that easy to measure it properly. You know, you're just sort of estimating how much value your equipment has lost. So there's all kinds of stuff going on here. It might not be so easy to estimate. That's why we have the statistical discrepancy. Yeah, and then not only that, but some of these costs are not necessarily, these items are not necessarily trading in the marketplace. And so they have to estimate how much they would sell for in the market. Like imagine a company, a bakery that owns their own farm. And so the farm grows the wheat, and then the wheat goes to the bakery, and then they make the bread. In order to do this method properly, we would need to know how much that wheat is actually worth. The problem is we're not actually selling it to anyone else, we're using it ourselves. And so that becomes a little challenging to figure out how much that wheat is actually worth in the marketplace. So there's a lot of awkward issues involved with this incomes approach. So let's sort of gloss over that now and jump ahead. Now, this, on the other hand, is really, really, really important. We're going to first, for the first time, introduce this concept of real versus nominal. So what exactly does this mean? The word real in economics means something has been adjusted for inflation. The word nominal means that it has not. Okay. So in other words, if let's say I tell you that this year the US economy produced $25 trillion worth of goods and services, that is nominal because it's using current dollars to measure it. If I make adjustments to that for inflation, then it becomes what we will call real GDP. And we'll see how that's done. But just be aware that no matter what concept we're looking at, it's not just GDP. Just think of real is adjusted for inflation. And nominal is not adjusted for inflation. In other words, this is just what we observe in the marketplace. That's the main distinction. Now, you notice in the bottom here, it says it is measured in current dollars. So in our case, that would be, of course, 2021 dollars. That's the market price of what we're producing right now. So how would you turn it into a real value? Well, the normal strategy would be to do this. You would pick a previous year, which is often called the base year. Now, believe it or not, at this point in time, the government, when it calculates real GDP, is using as a base year 1984. So that means to calculate real GDP, you're using $1984 to measure the value of what you're producing. Now, of course, you know, this is just an estimate. The nominal GDP is what we actually observe. This is an estimate. But what it does is it lets us figure out how much of the increase in GDP comes from goods and services and how much of it comes from inflation. That's important. It matters a great deal. So when nominal GDP increases, so if nominal GDP grows, some of that is due to greater output. More goods and services are being produced. But some of it is due to higher prices. And that means our standards of living are not growing. So imagine if the entire increase in GDP was due to higher prices. That means our standards of living haven't changed at all. So we hope that most of this increase is coming from greater output, and very little of it is coming from higher prices. But the only way to find out is to actually calculate real GDP. Now, there are government agencies where we can find this information. And in fact, I think I may have actually, I don't know if I put it in here or not. I may have downloaded this information. If not in this chapter, I think the next chapter is all about inflation anyway. Let me just take a look. I believe that that's where we will look at the government data that shows us how they calculate. Oh no, that's unemployment. All right, it must be chapter 7 then. All right, don't worry, we'll get to it. But I've been able to go to the internet and find real data that illustrates what we're doing here. So for example, in chapter 5, here it is. Here it is. This is GDP. All right. The reason why I downloaded this is because it makes it easier to see the actual accounts. And you'll see that if you look at them, they are a little bit more complex than what I've sort of indicated here. So for example, if you look carefully for, this is C right here, and they've broken it down into goods and services, durable and non-durable. But then when it comes to the investment spending, it's a little bit more complicated. They have fixed investments, which means they have structures and equipment and intellectual property. Residential would be the housing. And then here, like we had earlier, we have the change in private inventories. Exports, well, they broke it up into goods and services for both exports and imports. And then government expenditures, just like we had. So this isn't really that much more complicated than what we saw. But you can get more detailed information here, and where they break these down into smaller categories. And then what you can do is you can read across and you can see the exact values. For example, and this goes back to the fourth quarter of last year, about $21.5 trillion for GDP, compared to about 2 years earlier, about 20.2 trillion. So all the numbers are here. Now, this is coming from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And if you want to look at these numbers, you can feel free to do that anytime. In fact, let's see where that's located. I think I put the website in the slides. If not, let's take a look at it right now. Okay, it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis, GDP. Yeah, so in other words, it'll show you GDP by industry, by state, by country, you know. They have a lot of stuff here. And if you look over here on the side, they have also consumer spending. And you can take a closer look at that. Income and saving, industries, trade and investment. Most likely you'll be able to look at, yeah, here it is. We'll be looking at this in more detail later on in the course, but this represents our trade deficit. That's for a single quarter, by the way. Almost $200 billion for just one quarter. You can look at tables, you can look at graphs, you can look at everything, and they explain in great detail what they're showing you. So all this information is readily available on the internet. So if you're ever tempted to take a look at the actual data, it's very easy. Okay, so I'll tell you what, before I go any further, now, so I just want to make sure we started to discuss real versus nominal GDP, because one of the videos we're going to be looking at is about real versus nominal GDP. So I want you to have some background there so you know what we're talking about. And then we're going to start looking at numerical examples. But all right, I'll tell you what, let's take a look at our first video. Now, this one is still talking about what GDP is. And then, oh, all right, before we look at our videos, I just want to mention one more thing. Per capita. What does per capita mean? Whenever you see this in economics, per capita means per person or per head. It technically means per head. So in other words, some measures are done on a per capita basis. So imagine the following scenario. Suppose we want to know what the per capita GDP is for the US. So what you would do is take GDP over population. Okay, so you've got $23 trillion, let's say, over, let's say, 330 million. And let's see, what does that equal to? Let me find a calculator. Okay, that works out to almost exactly 69,700. Okay, so that means in a household of 4 people, the GDP would be, so in other words, we're assuming if you pretend that everybody produces exactly the same amount of GDP, that means this household accounted for $788 of that GDP. So in other words, the idea here is that, you know, you can measure the wealth of a country by its total GDP, but some feel that you're better off measuring it on a per capita basis. In other words, you want to know how an individual is doing. And so in that sense, while the US has the top GDP in the world, we don't necessarily have the top GDP per capita. There are other countries that have very high GDPs, but much smaller populations. In fact, the last time I looked, the #1 country, believe it or not, was Luxembourg. It's not hard to see why. Luxembourg is located between Belgium and France, I think. They are known for financial services. So, you know, you've got a very small country, but a lot of high-powered jobs there because they focus their attention on financial services. So they end up being a very affluent country, but it's a tiny little country compared to the US. So while our GDP is much larger than theirs, our GDP per capita is smaller. It's not a lot smaller. In fact, we can probably get a list. And some of the very wealthy oil countries that do not have very big populations also have higher GDP per capita. Let's see if we can quickly identify them. Okay, so you can see, oh, look, Macau slipped into ahead of Luxembourg. This is 2017. Qatar, of course, is a Middle Eastern country that produces a lot of oil. This is Macau, Luxembourg, Singapore, Brunei. Ireland is way up there. UAE, Arab Emirates, see a lot of oil countries. Switzerland, San Marino is a tiny little country in Italy. Norway, which has North Sea oil. Look at that. The US is only 13th as far as per capita goes, but still #1 as far as total goes. So yeah, you can see our numbers up around 60,000. Some of these countries, it makes you wonder how people can live on these numbers. Well, let's just say, like, look at this, Nepal, $900. I don't know how they survive. I really don't. But yeah, so the numbers are all over the place here. But anyway, let's get back to the first video. So the first video, like I said, is just, again, a discussion about what GDP actually is. Then we want to look at these two. I'm pretty sure each one of these is only about 4 or 5 minutes long, so we should have plenty of time. So first things first, let me send you the link, like I always do. And let's check it out.
Something we are all born. It's how we begin to find our place in the world. Get off down that dirt road and just keep going. Peter Millar.
How do you measure the size of an entire economy? Let's say I buy a coffee here in London for £3. Those £3 are factored into the United Kingdom's GDP. And so is this barista's salary and this espresso machine. In fact, most of what's around you is part of GDP. GDP is an important gauge of the overall health of an economy. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. Simply put, GDP measures the total value of all goods and services in a country. That means it measures a lot of stuff worth a lot of money. Here in the UK, GDP is around $2.5 trillion per year. In the United States, the world's biggest economy, it's around $19 trillion every year. How do you get to these numbers? Well, you can calculate GDP in a few different ways, but the most commonly used equation goes like this. Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports equals GDP. Let's break that down. Consumption is another way of saying consumer spending. It's the money you or I spend on physical goods like coffee and on services like a haircut. In many developed economies like the UK or the US, consumer spending makes up more than half of a country's GDP. The second part of the GDP equation is investment. This measures how much businesses spend on things like buildings, land, and equipment. It also includes a major consumer investment, buying a home. Investment can take a hit when the economy is suffering. You can see in this chart domestic business investment plummeted in the US during the financial crisis. That's because companies were trying to save money instead of putting it towards things like factories, machinery, and equipment. Okay, now we get to government spending. This is the money local, state, and national governments spend on things like roads, schools, and defense. Government spending varies a lot depending on each country's approach to public goods and services. Take, for example, France, where government spending amounts to roughly 56% of GDP. That's compared to 41% in the UK and 38% in the US. That brings us to the final part of the GDP calculation, net exports, or exports minus imports. A lot of countries have negative net exports, meaning they bring in more products than they send out. For example, the UK imports around $1 billion worth of coffee every year, but only exports around 315 million, meaning its net exports of coffee are negative. Countries around the world collect data on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. This makes GDP a universal measurement and a way for countries to stack up against one another. But it's not just the sum of the equation people look at. You'll often hear about the GDP growth rate, or the percentage change in GDP over time. Generally, if an economy is healthy, GDP growth expands. If an economy is in bad shape, GDP growth contracts. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth are referred to as a recession. But GDP doesn't always give a full picture of the economy. Critics say the equation puts too much weight on production and manufacturing, and not enough on services and the digital economy. Just think of Spotify. For $10 a month, you can listen to unlimited music from a huge range of artists. In the past, you'd have had to buy all of those albums separately, with each one contributing to GDP. It's hard to factor a digital service like Spotify into the GDP equation, which is used to measuring physical goods. GDP also doesn't measure economic equality and well-being. So even if a country is really rich according to GDP, wealth may be spread unevenly. Plus, GDP excludes unpaid work, like volunteering for charity or childcare, and it doesn't factor in costs like pollution or illegal activity. Some experts have come up with alternative measures to GDP that measure overall happiness and quality of life, but so far none of these have stuck. Maybe it's just too hard to put an economic value on that first sip of Morning Joe. Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. Thanks so much for watching our video. Be sure to check out more of our CNBC Explains over here and leave us any other ideas in the comment section. Talk to you later.
Visible is wireless that doesn't play games.
Okay, I guess everyone's done. So I guess you found that interesting. It pretty much reinforces what we were doing, but yes, it does point out some of the difficulties as I started to discuss about measuring GDP properly. And it's very hard for GDP to take into account the fact that goods improve in quality over time and that new products are introduced all the time. So, there's a lot of important ways in which GDP is not perfect. And the result is that it has a tendency to underestimate the true value of what we're actually producing. So it's kind of a pessimistic look at what's going on. But since it's the best that we have right now, we continue to use it. But government statisticians are always looking at new ways to improve it. So we always have to take it with a grain of salt. Let's just put it that way. Now, on here, they're going to talk about real GDP per capita. So they're doing two things with our GDP. They're converting it into real, from nominal to real, and then they're calculating per capita, real per capita. So in other words, they're taking the nominal, the total, and then they're adjusting it for inflation, and then they're adjusting it for the size of the population, so that what's left over is the amount per person, which in principle represents how much that person is producing, but also how much income they have. All right, so let's take a look at this. Let's see, here's the, oh, hold on. Here's the link. All right, let's do this.
Is real GDP per capita a good measure of the standard of living? People tell me all the time, you economists, you're too materialistic. Doesn't real GDP per capita just measure the things we buy? What about our health, our happiness, education? Well, real GDP per capita, it's not a perfect measure, but I want to show you why it's probably the best single measure of the average standard of living in a country. And that's not because material goods are the most important goods. It's because real GDP per capita is correlated with many of the other things that we care about. Let's start with life expectancy. Here we show real GDP per capita along the horizontal axis and life expectancy along the vertical axis. As you can see, there's a positive correlation. Countries that have a higher GDP per capita also have a higher life expectancy. Perhaps that's not too surprising. Let's take a look at happiness. Maybe this is a more surprising fact. This chart shows GDP per capita on the horizontal axis, and now a measure of happiness on the vertical axis. Again, we see a positive correlation. Countries with a higher real GDP per capita also tend to have happier people on average. Here's a data set from the United Nations. It's called the Human Development Index. It combines measures of life expectancy, education, and standard of living. Overall, you can see, in general, as GDP per capita increases, so does human development, at least as measured by this index. The basic story is pretty simple. When we have more goods and services, we can usually afford more of the other good things in life. So the good things in life, they tend to go together. However, GDP per capita is far from perfect. Here's one problem. GDP per capita misses the distribution of income. For example, let's compare the real GDP per capita of Nigeria, Pakistan, and Honduras. It's actually pretty similar. So you might think that all three countries have similar living standards. And yet in Nigeria, about 80% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. In Pakistan, it's only 60%. In Honduras, it's only 33%. How can the number of people living in abject poverty be so different when real GDP per capita is about the same? The reason is that income in Nigeria is much more unequally distributed than in Pakistan or Honduras. Nigeria has many poor people, but also some very rich people. So average income, it's about the same in Nigeria, Pakistan, or Honduras, even though there are more poor people in Nigeria. Over time, however, growth in real GDP per capita, whether in Nigeria, Pakistan, or Honduras, usually does indicate growth in everyone's incomes, including the incomes of the very poor. So this graph shows growth in per capita incomes along the horizontal axis, with growth in the incomes of the poorest 20% on the vertical axis. Once again, you see, as average per capita income increases, you also see increases in income of the very poor. Overall, real GDP and real GDP per capita have proven to be useful measures for comparing the standard of living of two different countries, or for comparing the same country at different points in time. Okay, so now that you know that real GDP per capita, it's a good measure of the standard of living, we get to the really crucial question. How do we increase the standard of living? How do we grow an economy? How do we increase real GDP per capita? That is a big question, the big question of development. We'll be tackling it in a number of future videos. But before you go, take a moment to let us know how we're doing. What do you think of the videos? How can we improve? Drop us an email or leave us some feedback on our website. Thanks.
If you want to test yourself, click Practice Questions. Or if you're ready to move on, you can click
All right, well, that was kind of interesting. I mean, he's basically making the point that GDP per capita is important as a measure of standards of living, and that he did make the interesting case that in some of these countries with very low real GDPs per capita, people live better than in others, because in some of those cases, like Nigeria is an oil-rich country, and so it makes sense that they would have several very wealthy people, and a lot of the rest of the people are very poor, where the income might be more equally distributed in Honduras, let's say. So that is also something that needs to be taken into account when we're measuring standards of living. But for the most part, we can think of this as a method of showing how standards of living change over time and how one country compares with another. Anyway, so now this next one is about nominal versus real, which we already have started to discuss. They're going to show us how nominal GDP can be converted into real to take into account the impact of inflation. All right, let's look at this. Hold on, let me stop that. Stop that. All right, here we go. All right, let's look at it. Let's check this out.
Is the economy growing? Are people better off today than they were 4 years ago? What about 40 years ago? The GDP statistic can help us to answer all of these questions. But first, we do need to make some modifications. As we discussed in our first video, GDP sums up the prices of all finished goods and services. So that means that there are two ways that GDP can increase. First, prices can increase. In this case, the GDP number goes up, but the economy isn't actually producing more goods and services. It's inflation, which is driving the higher GDP. The increase in GDP, it might look good on paper, but it's a mirage, a nominal increase only. The other way that GDP can increase is if we do produce more valuable goods and services. And that could mean simply more goods and services, or better goods and services, more highly valued goods and services. It's this second type of increase in GDP that we want. This isn't a mirage. This is a real increase in GDP. Real GDP measures the second type of growth. In the real GDP statistic, it controls for inflation by adding up all the goods and services produced in an economy using the same set of prices over time, the same set of prices. Real GDP tells us if the prices of goods and services hadn't changed, how much would GDP have increased or decreased? Real GDP, it's typically what we really care about. Let's give an example. We'll be using a fantastic tool called the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED. FRED is every economist's best friend. So let's Google US nominal GDP FRED. Here's what we get. We can see that we have grown from a GDP in 1950 of $320 billion to a GDP in 2015 of over $17 trillion. Wow, that suggests that our economy has gotten 55 times bigger. But hold on, wait a moment, you might say. My grandmother told me that a loaf of bread used to cost a dime, and now it costs a couple of dollars. That's right. If we want to compare our economy over time, we need to control for changes in prices. So we don't want to look at nominal GDP. We're more interested in real GDP. So let's Google real US GDP FRED. Here's what we get. This graph measures real GDP in 2009 dollars. That means using 2009 prices. This graph tells us that using 2009 prices consistently, that in 1950, all the goods and services produced at that time were worth about $2 trillion. In comparison, in 2015, all the goods and services produced at that time were worth about $16 trillion. So while nominal GDP says that the economy is 55 times bigger in 2015 than in 1950, real GDP shows us that it's 8 times bigger. That's still pretty good, but a big difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay, so now we've controlled for prices, but there's another big difference in the US economy in 1950 compared to today. Right, there's a lot more people today. We can control for the population size by using real GDP per capita or per person. By dividing real GDP by a country's population, we get a good, albeit imperfect, measure of the average standard of living in a country. So once again, let's Google real GDP per capita FRED. Here's what we get. In 1950, real GDP per capita, measured in constant prices, was about $14,000. In 2015, real GDP per capita is about $50,000. So on average, people in 2015 have a standard of living that's 4 times higher than the people in 1950. That's a pretty big and a remarkable increase in the standard of living. By the way, since real GDP increased by 8 times and real GDP per capita increased by 4 times, we know immediately that the population approximately doubled between 1950 and 2015. Now let's take a closer look at this graph. We can see another reason why we're interested in the GDP statistic. Real GDP per capita declines during recessions. In fact, a decline in real GDP is part of what defines a recession. Declines in real GDP also tend to be accompanied by increases in unemployment. You can see here that when real GDP dips, the unemployment rate spikes. Now here's another nice feature of the FRED database. On the real GDP per capita graph, click Edit Data Series and then switch to percent annual changes. So now we can see immediately the annual changes in real GDP. You can see, for example, the big recession in 2008 and 2009. In 2009, for example, the economy shrank by 3.6% compared to the year before. That's a very big and a very unpleasant decline. Okay, so now you've got your hands around real GDP as a way of measuring the health of our economy. And I said that real GDP per capita is a good, albeit imperfect measure of the average standard of living in a country. But is that really true? Does an increase in real GDP per capita mean that we're better off? That's the view that I'm going to defend in the next video.
If you want to test yourself, click Practice Questions. Or, if you're ready to move on, you can click Go to the next video. You can also visit mruniversity.com to see our entire library of videos and resources.
Okay, I guess we're done for the day. There's more videos that I'd like you to see in the same area. For example, one that discusses more intensively what are the shortcomings of GDP, but it's a very important topic. And so, we can spend a lot more time with it, but when we're done with chapter 5, we'll move on to 6, which is the unemployment rate that we'll be looking at. And I think chapter 7 is our introduction to inflation. So we've got some very important topics coming up. But since we didn't finish 5, we probably shouldn't do any more problem sets just yet. So just between now and next Monday, or Tuesday rather, just make sure that you're keeping up with the material, flip through the slides, make sure you understand what we've been doing. And I'll see you all next Tuesday. All right.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you for class, Professor. Have a
Okay.
good day. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Okay, great. See you next time.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Okay, bye.